a city nobody was supposed to find. Above the Urubamba River, where the jungle climbs into cloud, there is a city that was never supposed to be found. No conquistador ever marched into its plazas. No colonial church was ever built over its temples, the way one was built directly on top of the Inca Sun Temple in Cusco. For nearly 400 years, while empires rose and fell across the rest of Peru, this place simply disappeared, wrapped in vines and cloud forest, known only to a handful of farming families in the valley below. Today, we call it Machu Picchu, and it is one of the most photographed places on Earth, printed on postcards, coffee mugs, and bucket lists everywhere. But almost everything most visitors believe about it, why it was built, who actually lived here, even its own name, turns out to be wrong, or at least far stranger than the postcard version lets on. This is the real story of the lost city in the clouds, the empire that built it, the earthquake, engineering that still holds it together 5 centuries later, the bones that quietly rewrote its history twice, and the modern crowds now threatening to love it to death. The emperor who built an empire. To understand Machu Picchu, you first have to understand the man who almost certainly ordered it built. Pachacuti, the 9th ruler of the Inca. Around the year 1438, Pachacuti was a prince, not yet a king, when a rival highland people called the Chanca marched on Cusco, and the reigning Inca ruler, Pachacuti's own father, fled the capital in panic rather than fight. Pachacuti refused to run. According to Inca oral history, he rallied the city's remaining defenders, and legend even claims that stones scattered across the battlefield rose up and transformed into warriors to fight alongside him, a myth later used to justify his claim to greatness. He won a decisive victory, then deposed his own father, took the fringed royal headband for himself, and began transforming a small highland kingdom into an empire that would eventually stretch over 2,500 miles from modern Ecuador down through Chile, the largest state ever built in the pre-Columbian Americas. He rebuilt Cusco itself into an imperial capital, reportedly rerouting entire rivers to reshape the city's layout. New radiocarbon evidence suggests Pachacuti's conquests began earlier than historians long assumed, which means he had even more time than we thought to commission monuments worthy of that empire. And Machu Picchu appears to have been one of the first and most personal. Choosing the impossible ridge. Why build here, on a knife-edge ridge, 3 to 4 days walk from the capital, nearly 3,000 feet lower in elevation than Cusco and buried in cloud forest most of the year? Part of the answer is comfort. Cusco sits cold and dry above 11,000 feet. This saddle between 2 peaks, Machu Picchu Mountain and Huayna Picchu, sits at roughly 7,900 feet in a warmer, wetter microclimate where maize and coca could grow almost year-round, a genuine luxury for a highland emperor. Part of the answer is politics. Inca custom held that a dead emperor's estate stayed his own. His descendants kept his mummy, his servants, and his lands, and used the estate's income to fund his cult of memory forever, forbidden from touching it for their own needs. So a new emperor, wanting land no rival heir could claim, needed to acquire fresh territory of his own, and this remote, recently conquered frontier between empire and jungle was exactly that. And part of the answer may be sacred geography. The site is oriented toward sacred peaks, the Inca called Apis, mountain spirits believed to watch over the land in a location almost engineered by nature to feel closer to the sky. Builders even quarried much of their granite directly from the ridge itself, cutting transport distances to almost nothing. Building without iron, wheel, or mortar. Here is what makes Machu Picchu genuinely astonishing. not the view, the engineering. The Inca had no iron or steel tools, only bronze and stone. No draft animals strong enough to haul multi-ton blocks the way oxen did in Europe, and no wheeled carts, because the wheel was never adopted for transport anywhere in the pre-Columbian Americas. And yet, they quarried, moved, and fitted granite blocks so precisely that many walls still stand today without a single drop of mortar. Stonemasons used harder river cobbles as hammerstones, pounding softer granite into rough shape, then patiently pecking each face until neighboring blocks matched so closely that, even now, you cannot slide a knife blade into the seam. Workers likely tested the fit repeatedly, rubbing stones together with sand and water as an abrasive marking high spots with charcoal, and grinding them down over and over until two irregular faces mated perfectly. It was not fast. Estimates suggest a single finely fitted wall could take a specialized team months of patient labor. But the result was built to outlast the empire that built it, and, remarkably, it has. Stones that dance in earthquakes. This region sits in one of the most seismically active corridors on the planet, and Inca engineers clearly knew it. Rather than fighting earthquakes with rigid, mortared walls the way European masons would later build, Inca engineers built to move with them. Many walls use polygonal blocks, some with a dozen or more angled faces, interlocked like a three-dimensional puzzle rather than stacked in even rows, a style visible even in Cusco itself. In the famous 12 angled stone tourists still run their hands over today. When the ground shakes, these irregular joints let each stone shift slightly, absorb energy, and settle back into place instead of cracking straight through. Doorways, niches, and windows were built with trapezoidal shapes, narrower at the top than the bottom, a form that resists collapse far better than a plain rectangle. Walls also lean subtly inward as they rise, adding further stability. Modern engineers who have modeled these techniques on shake tables find that Inca-style dry stone construction can survive tremors that would flatten a conventional mortared wall, which may be the single biggest reason so much of Machu Picchu is still standing 5 centuries and countless earthquakes later, while many later colonial buildings nearby have needed constant repair. The city beneath the city. Walk through Machu Picchu today, and you are only seeing part of the engineering, because researchers estimate that more than half of the total construction effort went into work you cannot see at all: foundations, fill, and drainage. Beneath the plazas and buildings, crews laid down layers of packed gravel and crushed stone specifically chosen to let water pass through rather than pool and freeze, which in a high-altitude climate would otherwise crack stonework apart within a handful of winters. Engineers have documented more than 130 separate drainage outlets built directly into walls, terraces, and canals, engineered from the very first phase of construction, not bolted on as an afterthought. Rainwater is guided off roofs, down channels cut into stone, into a system that ultimately still functions today, 500 years on, largely unmaintained and untouched by modern plumbers. It is, in a very real sense, an invisible city of gravel and channels holding up the visible one, and engineers who study it consider it arguably the most underappreciated part of the entire site. Terraces that hold a mountain together.
These incredible terraces,
The famous green terraces stepping down the mountainside were never just farmland. They were structural engineering disguised as agriculture. Roughly 700 of these andinis were carved into the slope, each one a retaining wall, packed with layered fill in a very specific order. Large stones at the base for drainage, then gravel above that, then sandy soil, then rich topsoil on top. That layering did double duty, preventing the erosion and landslides that would otherwise threaten to slide the entire hillside and the city sitting on it into the valley during heavy Andean rain, while also creating dozens of distinct microclimates at different elevations within a very small footprint. Some researchers believe certain terrace clusters may even have functioned as an experimental agricultural laboratory, letting Inca farmers test how the same crop performed at different temperatures and sun exposure within just a few hundred vertical feet of mountainside. Practical farmland, flood control, and applied botany, all built into the same sloping stone steps that modern tourists now photograph without ever suspecting the engineering hiding beneath the grass. A clock carved in stone. Near the highest point of the urban sector stands a carved granite outcrop the Inca call de Dathi Inti Huatana, often translated loosely as hitching post of the sun. It is not a sundial in the way we usually mean the word. There is no dial face, no printed numbers. Instead, its precisely angled edges cast shadows that shift with the seasons, letting priests track the sun's path and identify key dates like the solstices and equinoxes, information that mattered enormously for an agricultural empire that needed to know exactly when to plant and when to harvest at high altitude. Its orientation is also believed to align with surrounding sacred peaks, tying the stone's function to that same mountain spirit geography that shaped the whole site. Spanish colonizers deliberately smashed similar ritual stones elsewhere in the Andes precisely because of their religious significance to Inca sun worship, which makes the Intihuatana at Machu Picchu unusually rare, a solar instrument that survived largely intact simply because the Spanish never found the city that housed it. Today, it remains carefully roped off, both to protect the fragile stone from decades of tourist touching and, symbolically, to protect one of the last uncracked calendars the Inca ever built. Temple of the Sun, Temple of Three Windows. Two structures anchor the sacred core of the city. The Temple of the Sun is a curved, exquisitely fitted tower built around a natural granite outcrop, with a trapezoidal window angled to catch the sunrise on the June solstice, illuminating a stone altar inside at exactly the moment the Inca considered most sacred each year. Beneath it, a carved cave many researchers call the royal tomb may have held mummified rulers or honored ancestors, continuing their symbolic presence in the world of the living long after death. Nearby, the Temple of the Three Windows opens onto the main plaza with three trapezoidal openings framing the mountains beyond, and many scholars connect that number 3 to Inca cosmology, an upper world of gods and stars, an earthly middle world of the living, and a lower world of ancestors and the dead. Whether or not that exact symbolism is correct, the effect of standing inside is unmistakable even today. The architecture itself seems designed to make a visitor feel small in front of the mountains, precisely as its builders intended. The Sacred Rock and the Sun Gate. Two more landmarks frame the whole experience of arriving at Machu Picchu. Near the northern edge of the site sits the Sacred Rock, a large flat stone deliberately carved and positioned so its silhouette echoes the shape of the mountain peak rising directly behind it. A piece of stone sculpture built to blend architecture seamlessly into landscape. And for pilgrims arriving on foot along the original Inca trail, rather than by modern train, the first glimpse of the city comes through Inti Punku, the Sun Gate, a stone doorway perched on the ridge above the ruins. On the June solstice, the rising sun aligns directly through that gateway and onto the city below, a detail almost certainly intentional, given how carefully the Inca tracked solar movement elsewhere at the site. Modern trekkers who hike the multi-day trail specifically to reach the Sun Gate at dawn are, whether they realize it or not, recreating an arrival sequence engineered by Inca architects 5 centuries ago, one final piece of theater built into the landscape itself. Condor, Puma, Serpent.
For the Inca, these mountains
Andean belief organized the universe around three sacred animals, and their symbolism is carved directly into Machu Picchu's stone. The condor, a bird capable of soaring higher than almost any other on Earth, represented the heavens and was believed to carry messages and souls between worlds. A natural rock formation near one temple was shaped and framed by masons to resemble a condor's outstretched wings, with a carved beak and collar stone below completing the image on the ground, best appreciated from directly above. The puma, a powerful, silent predator of the middle world, is echoed in some scholars' reading of Cusco's own city plan, said to have been laid out in the shape of a puma when viewed from above, with a hilltop fortress forming its head. The serpent, moving through cracks in the earth, represented the underworld and ancestral knowledge, and appears carved into stairways and doorframes throughout the site. Together, the condor, puma, and serpent formed a complete Inca map of existence, sky, earth, and underworld. And Machu Picchu's builders wove that entire cosmology into the stones long before anyone outside the Andes ever laid eyes on them. Climbing Huayna Picchu. The dramatic, sharply peaked mountain that appears behind almost every classic photograph of Machu Picchu is not just scenery. It is a second archaeological site in its own right. Huayna Picchu. Inca builders carved narrow stone steps directly into its nearly vertical face, along with small terraces and a cluster of structures near the summit that some archaeologists call the Temple of the Moon, tucked partway up inside a natural cave. Climbing it today requires a separate, strictly limited permit, since the trail is narrow enough that Peru's park authorities cap how many visitors can ascend each day. The final stretch involves steep stone stairs with a fixed cable for support and genuinely serious drop-offs on either side. Not a casual afternoon stroll. Historians still debate exactly why the Inca bothered building on such punishingly steep terrain at all, with theories ranging from an elite lookout post, watching the approaches to the city, to a purely ceremonial site meant to physically embody the mountain spirit reverence that shaped the whole valley. Who actually lived here? For decades after its rediscovery, Machu Picchu was popularly described as a mysterious lost city, or even a secret temple staffed mainly by chosen women. The reality uncovered by later research is both more mundane and more interesting. Population estimates suggest as few as a few hundred people lived here permanently, a number likely rising during the emperor's visits and religious festivals, then shrinking again in the off-season, more royal retreat than metropolis. Skeletal remains recovered from cemeteries around the site show a genuinely mixed community. Nobles and their attendants, priests and priestesses, skilled masons and farmers, servants and specialists, brought from many different regions of the empire, identified through variations in skull shape, diet, and even genetic markers preserved in bone. Far from an isolated cult, Machu Picchu functioned like a well-staffed royal household, with the Emperor Pachacuti and his family as occasional honored guests, supported year-round by a permanent working population who kept the estate's terraces, temples, and storehouses running whether or not the emperor was in residence. Mummies, ancestors, and the living estate.
Welcome, Your Majesty.
To the Inca, death did not end a ruler's role in daily life. It simply changed it. Deceased emperors were mummified and dressed in fine textiles, brought out during major festivals to attend ceremonies, offered food and drink, and consulted symbolically on important state decisions by living attendants who spoke on their behalf. This belief is precisely why an emperor's personal estate, like Machu Picchu, mattered so much. It existed to sustain his mummy's household and cult of memory in perpetuity, staffed and provisioned long after his death, which is also part of why a new ruler always needed fresh land of his own rather than inheriting his father's estate. Andean religious practice elsewhere in the empire also included capacocha, rare ceremonial offerings performed at the very highest, most sacred mountain shrines during moments of crisis. A practice researchers know about mainly through remains found on high volcanic peaks, far from Machu Picchu itself, rather than at the city. Understanding this deep reverence for ancestors and sacred mountains helps explain why an entire royal city could be built purely to honor the memory of one still powerful, if no longer living, ruler. The bones that rewrote the story. When Hiram Bingham's expedition excavated burial caves around Machu Picchu, early analysis of the skeletons concluded that roughly 3 out of 4 were female, feeding a romantic theory that the site was primarily a refuge for the Incas' chosen virgins of the sun. Later, far more rigorous forensic work re-examined those same bones using modern skeletal and dental analysis techniques unavailable in Bingham's day, and found the sex ratio was actually close to even, undermining the sun virgin theory almost entirely. Then, in 2021, a Yale-led team used accelerator mass spectrometry, a highly precise form of radiocarbon dating on teeth and bone from 26 individuals across 4 separate cemeteries. Their results pushed the estimated founding of Machu Picchu back to roughly 1420, at least 20 years earlier than the traditional history books claimed, and showed the site remained in continuous use right up until close to the Spanish conquest, around 1530. 2 rounds of careful bone science, decades apart, quietly rewrote both who lived at Machu Picchu and exactly when its story began, proving that even a world-famous site can still surprise the scientists studying it. Roads to nowhere and everywhere. Machu Picchu was never meant to stand alone. It was one node in an imperial road network called the Capac Gyan, which eventually stretched roughly 25,000 miles across mountain, desert, and jungle, an infrastructure achievement often compared to the Roman road system, and now recognized by UNESCO across 6 different modern countries. Along these routes ran the Chasqui, elite relay runners trained from childhood who carried messages, goods, and even fresh seafood from the coast, sprinting in short, high-speed relays between way stations while blowing shell trumpets to alert the next runner ahead, so that news could cross hundreds of miles in just a few days, astonishingly fast for a civilization without wheeled transport. Where cliffs made solid roads impossible, Inca engineers strung woven grass suspension bridges across gorges. Remarkably, one such bridge at Quesuachaca is still rebuilt entirely by hand every single year by local communities, using techniques passed down since Inca times, now recognized as a living piece of intangible world heritage. One dramatic stretch of trail approaching Machu Picchu itself narrows to a ledge blasted directly into a sheer cliff face, defensible by a single guard and easily dismantled, a literal drawbridge carved straight into the mountain. The empire falls. Machu Picchu's story cannot be separated from the empire's sudden collapse. In the 1520s, the reigning emperor, Huayna Capac, died suddenly. Most historians believe from a disease introduced by early contact with Europeans, quite possibly smallpox, spreading ahead of the conquistadors themselves along existing Inca trade routes. His death triggered a brutal civil war between 2 of his sons, Huáscar and Atahualpa, tearing the empire apart from within at the exact moment Spanish forces under Francisco Pizarro landed on the Peruvian coast in 1532. Pizarro captured Atahualpa, and in one of history's most infamous ransoms, agreed to release him in exchange for a room filled once with gold and twice with silver, then executed him anyway once the treasure had been delivered, before marching on and occupying Cusco itself. Yet remarkably, no Spanish force is known to have ever discovered Machu Picchu. It sat outside the main roads the conquistadors used, hidden by cloud forest terrain that made it genuinely difficult to stumble upon. And by the time Spanish colonial administrators were mapping the region in real detail, the site seems to have already been quietly emptied of its people. Why was it abandoned? So, why did a working royal estate, still under construction in places, simply empty out? No single Inca document survives to answer directly, so historians argue from circumstantial evidence. The leading theory points to smallpox as a virgin soil disease with no prior exposure anywhere in the Americas. It could kill the majority of an isolated community within a single outbreak, and Machu Picchu's relatively small, tightly knit population would have been especially vulnerable to exactly that kind of collapse. A second theory points to prolonged drought around the time of the Spanish invasion, straining the terraced water and food system that depended on reliable seasonal rainfall to function. A third, more political theory suggests that once the imperial court in Cusco collapsed into civil war and then conquest, an estate that existed specifically to serve one dead emperor's household simply lost its economic reason to exist, and its remaining staff drifted away to survive elsewhere. Most researchers today suspect it was some combination of all three: disease, drought, and the sudden collapse of the very government whose gold had funded the place. 4 centuries of silence. Once abandoned, Machu Picchu did not stay a total secret. It simply stopped being anyone's priority. Farming families in the Urubamba Valley below continued to know the ruins were there, occasionally climbing up to graze animals or clear small garden plots among the ancient terraces, even as jungle vines and moss slowly reclaimed the finely cut stonework above them. In 1902, a local landowner named Agustin Lizarraga is recorded to have visited the site and, in a small act that would later prove historically important, carved his own name and the date directly onto a wall inside the temple of the 3 windows. For the wider world beyond that valley, though, Machu Picchu simply did not exist. No maps marked it accurately. No scholarly expedition had cataloged it. It was hiding in plain sight, well over 1,000 feet above a river that thousands of travelers had crossed over the centuries without ever looking up to see what was waiting in the clouds directly above them. Hiram Bingham's expedition. In July 1911, an American historian and Yale lecturer named Hiram Bingham arrived in Peru, chasing an entirely different target: Vilcabamba, the last refuge of Inca resistance against Spanish rule. Guided by a local farmer named Melchor Arteaga, who knew of ruins on the ridge above his home, Bingham's small party crossed the wild Urubamba River on a flimsy log bridge in cold, rainy weather, then climbed a steep, overgrown trail with the help of a young boy from a nearby farming family who knew the route by heart. What Bingham found stopped him cold: an entire stone city, its finest walls still standing, swallowed almost completely by jungle growth. He photographed it, measured it, and would later publish it to the world in a famous 1913 issue of National Geographic magazine, instantly making Machu Picchu one of the most famous archaeological sites on the planet. And Bingham himself is often cited as one inspiration behind the swashbuckling explorer-archaeologist figure that would later show up throughout American pop culture. But inside the ruins that day, Bingham found something that complicated his own triumph: Agustin Lizarraga's name and the date, already carved into the temple wall 9 years earlier. The wrong name? The wrong city?
The lost city.
Bingham himself recorded in his own field notes that Lizarraga deserved credit as an earlier visitor. Yet, the discovery narrative that reached the American public largely erased that fact, along with the generations of local Quechua families who had always known the ruins existed and occasionally farmed among them. There is a second, stranger twist. Bingham believed he had actually found Vilcabamba, the lost rebel capital he originally set out to locate. And it took decades of further research by other scholars to establish that the true Vilcabamba lay in a completely different location deeper in the jungle, a case of mistaken identity that stood unofficially corrected for years. And in 2022, a study of Bingham's own expedition maps and colonial-era land documents argued that the name we use today may itself be a mix-up. Contemporary records suggest the Inca likely called the neighboring peak, and possibly the city itself, Huayna Picchu, while the name Machu Picchu, meaning Old Peak, properly belonged to the taller mountain rising behind it. A century later, the wrong name has simply become permanent through sheer global familiarity, printed on every ticket, and souvenir shop sign in the valley. Crates to Yale. Bingham's expeditions did not just photograph Machu Picchu. Over several return trips between 1911 and 1915, his teams excavated and removed thousands of artifacts, ceramics, tools, and human remains, shipping them to Yale University in the United States for study, under an agreement with the Peruvian government that the items would eventually be returned once research was complete. They were not returned, not for generations. Peru formally requested the collection back as early as 1917 and was largely ignored for most of the 20th century as the artifacts sat in Yale's collections. The dispute finally became a full international diplomatic issue in the 2000s, escalating into lawsuits and direct appeals to the American government until Yale agreed to a phased repatriation beginning around 2011 and continuing over the following years. Thousands of pieces eventually returned to Peru, many now held in a dedicated museum in Cusco, run jointly by Yale and a Peruvian university. A rare case where a century-old colonial-era archaeological dispute was actually resolved, even if only after nearly 100 years of formal requests. Digging deeper. What modern science found? Modern laboratory tools have continued to quietly rewrite details Bingham could never have known. That 2021 radiocarbon study did more than adjust dates by testing remains from 4 distinct cemeteries. Rather than relying on old excavation notes, it gave researchers their first high-confidence timeline for exactly how long the site was continuously occupied, roughly a full century, ending almost precisely when the Spanish conquest was underway elsewhere in the empire. Isotope analysis of bones and teeth has also let scientists trace where individual residents grew up based on the water and food chemistry absorbed into their skeletons decades earlier, confirming that workers and specialists were drawn from many corners of the empire, not just the immediate valley around Cusco. Ground-penetrating surveys and structural engineering studies have separately confirmed just how deliberately those drainage systems and building foundations were designed from the very start. 500 years after it was built, Machu Picchu is still actively being investigated, not with picks and shovels, but with mass spectrometers, isotope ratios, and laser scanners. Ancient aliens and lost civilizations? Because Inca stonework looks so improbably precise, Machu Picchu has become a magnet for fringe theories claiming it simply could not have been built by the people who actually lived there. Some popular claims argue the finest walls must be the work of a vastly older, more advanced lost civilization, predating the Inca by thousands of years, or even extraterrestrial visitors with technology no Bronze Age society could match. These theories tend to rest on the same basic argument that Bronze Age tools alone could not achieve millimeter-tight joints between multi-ton blocks. But experimental archaeologists have directly replicated Inca stone-fitting techniques using only period-appropriate tools, hammerstones, sand abrasive, and patient trial fitting, successfully reproducing comparably tight seams, and the radiocarbon and stylistic evidence overwhelmingly places construction firmly within Pachacuti's 15th century reign, not some vanished prior age. None of this makes the real achievement less impressive. If anything, understanding exactly how patient, skilled human beings without iron or wheels pulled this off is a far more remarkable story than shrugging and crediting a lost civilization or aliens with work that Andean stonemasons demonstrably did themselves. A cloud forest, not just a ruin.
Nestled high in the
Part of what makes Machu Picchu genuinely unusual on a global stage is that UNESCO recognizes it as a mixed World Heritage Site, honored for both culture and nature at once, one of only a small handful of places on Earth to earn that dual status. The surrounding cloud forest sanctuary is home to remarkable biodiversity found almost nowhere else at this elevation, including the spectacled bear, the only bear species native to South America, along with hundreds of documented orchid species, and a wide range of birds rarely seen by visitors focused entirely on the stonework beneath their feet. The Inca themselves seem to have chosen this location partly because of that same rich environment, a warm, fertile pocket tucked between colder highlands and lower jungle, ideal for growing crops that could not survive at Cusco's altitude. Modern conservation efforts increasingly treat the ruins and the surrounding ecosystem as a single, inseparable responsibility, since protecting the crumbling stonework from erosion and protecting the rare cloud forest species living around it ultimately depend on the very same careful land management. A wonder at risk. Machu Picchu's greatest modern threat is not looters or earthquakes. It is its own popularity. In 2025, the site drew more than 1.6 million visitors, straining a 15th century stone city, never designed for anything close to that kind of daily foot traffic. In September 2025, the organization behind the New Seven Wonders of the World campaign issued a formal warning that Machu Picchu risked losing its wonder status entirely, citing overcrowding, weak conservation enforcement, and unresolved local conflicts over ticketing and transport into the site. UNESCO, notably, has stated the site is not formally on its list of World Heritage Sites in danger, but Peruvian authorities responded by approving a master plan running through 2031, aimed at capping visitor numbers, defining stricter one-way walking circuits, and involving local communities more directly in decisions about the site's future. A controversial new international airport planned for nearby Chinchero, expected around 2027, threatens to make access even easier and faster for international tourists, and conservationists worry it could accelerate the very overcrowding. The master plan is specifically trying to control the city in the clouds today. Stand at the classic overlook at sunrise, and it is easy to see why Machu Picchu still captures imaginations more than a century after Bingham's expedition made it famous worldwide. It survived earthquakes because its builders engineered flexibility into every wall. It survived 4 centuries buried in jungle because it was never truly lost to the people who lived nearby, only to the wider world beyond that valley. It survived colonization because the Spanish never found it, and it has survived rediscovery, in a very different sense, only because ongoing conservation efforts are now working hard to help it survive the sheer weight of modern love and modern tourism. The emperor who built it wanted a private paradise fit for a living god. Instead, he built something that would outlive his empire, his dynasty, and every language his people spoke, standing quietly in the clouds until the whole world finally learned to find its way back up that mountain.